joining us today. My name is Brian Myers. I am from the University of Florida. Agriculture, yeah, that's right, Gator Chomp. Agriculture Education and Communication Department. With me today is Mr. Andrew Thorin.
I'm also from the University of Florida as a PhD student, so Dr. Myers is my advisor, so that's why I'm here. No, not really. But I'm here today. We're going to talk about some inquiry-based instruction. I was a high school agriculture teacher in Illinois for 3 years, and then came down to University of Florida to work on my PhD program. So it's kind of neat to be able to give a little bit of in-service and share some of the things that we think are pretty valuable in the classroom today with people that are actually still doing that stuff in the classroom.
Prior to going to the University of Florida, I also taught high school agriculture in Illinois, but as I was leaving Illinois, Andrew was starting teaching, so we never actually worked together there. But we're going to talk a little bit about how many of you have attended other agri-science type workshops before in there. A few folks, okay? When Larry Gosen and Mike Mitchell contacted me about doing a workshop, they wanted to do something about agri-science to the next level. What are some things that we can do? And one of the things we always talk about with agri-science is we think we have to have a lot of equipment. Some folks down the aisle there, they're doing some great workshops, great lesson plans that you're doing that require some equipment. But we're going to do some things that are maybe a little more low-tech. Things that we really don't take a whole lot of equipment to do. Now, to make this thing happen, we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I'm going to ask you to work in pairs. So you get to make a new friend today before we get going too far. So if you would, kind of sit at the same table. It's going to be a little better if you guys kind of pair up with each other and have folks work at the same table. Because one of the keys we're going to talk about here is in agri-science, one of the best ways to teach leadership is in a lab setting and working with your students in groups and having those kind of things work. So to start off with, we're going to run through an activity that I did with my high school students and with 8th graders. I taught in a big school in western Illinois. We had 264 students, grades 9 through 12. A big school, right? I taught 8th graders, had them through a wheel, and then I taught 9 through 12. I did this lab with my 8th graders, I did this lab with my freshmen, and I did it again when they were juniors or seniors in my advanced agri-science course, because by the time they're juniors and seniors, they forgot what they've done when they were freshmen anyway. But we're going to kind of walk through this thing. We have very high-tech equipment. I hope we're all prepared to utilize this equipment today. We have scales, and we have bubble gum. This is the high-tech equipment that we will be using today. What you and your partner will be given here shortly. As soon as I open the child-resistant bubblegum wrapper, here we go, and I throw it on the ground. You and your partner will be given a piece of bubblegum in the wrapper. We've got 4 scales we'll scatter around among the room, so a couple groups are going to have to share with there. What you're going to do is weigh your gum in the wrapper. Make sure your scale is set on grams. They should, by default, should come on grams, but if you hit the wrong button too many times, it'll go to ounces. But in grams, record the mass or the weight of this bubble gum. So you're going to need it on a piece of paper somewhere. Then what I want you to do is to develop a hypothesis. And other than just being hard for me to say, what is a hypothesis? A guess? A guess? Educated guess? Educated guess based on what? What? Prior knowledge, information, research, experience, those sort of things, based off what we know at the time. So what I would like for you to do is, based on your own experience and knowledge, develop a hypothesis about what you think will happen to the weight or the mass of this bubble gum when you chew it. Please write that down somewhere and write down why you think the mass will change or not change when you chew it. Just write down your own hypothesis somewhere. Pardon? At the end of this session, do you have... I do not. hypothesis. Okay, Mr. Thorne, if you would help me count. What are the possible things that could happen to the mass of this piece of bubble gum when we chew it? It could go up, it could go down, it could stay the same. In all honesty, I've done this lab about 1,000 times now, and those are the only 3 possibilities I've come up with. If you come up with a 4th, please let me know. So, let's do a quick count here. Yes, I am from Florida. We have trouble with counting, but we're going to fuddle our way through it anyway. How many people say the mass of this bubble gum is going to go up? Raise your hands high. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 people say the mass will go up. How many say the mass will go down? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 said down. And I think that's everybody. Anybody say the mass is going to stay the same? I don't believe so. Using my skills of mathematics, that adds up with everybody. So, someone who said the mass will go up. Why do you think the mass will go up? Raise. Anyone? Why do you think the mass will go up?
Initially, because of the increased weight from the saliva.
Okay, you're going to spit a big loogie in it, so the mass is going to go up. How many people say it's going to go down? Someone said it was going down. Why do you think it's going to go down?
Because the sugars are going to dissolve and be swallowed.
Okay, we're dissolving sugar. We're going to take something else out. Anybody else have anything else? Why the mass is going to go up or go down? So we got somebody's going to add to it, somebody's going to take away from it. Put this thing back on. Alrighty. Now, when I teach school, I do the same lab with. I teach in our agriculture education program at UF. I teach a laboratory practices course. I model it the same way to them. At this time, when I taught high school and everything else, I would collect your hypothesis from you. Why would I do that? Because they would change it. So I would collect it right now. I also asked you to write down your justification for it. Why did I ask you to do that? Because it's a hypothesis. That's what to me, that's the most important thing. One of the things we want to teach in Agriscience and all the curriculum we do is critical thinking. I don't want you just making a guess. I want to see your thought process behind it. And to me, that's the most important thing. So with your hypothesis there, we're going to go up, down, or stay the same. What you're going to do now is once you have your gum, you're going, one person from your group, after you've weighed it and recorded the mass, you're going to chew the gum for 30 seconds. So you're going to have a chewer in your team, and you're going to have a timer on your team. Okay? So you're going to chew for 30 seconds. Then the fun begins. Then you're going to record the weight of that gum after you've chewed it for 30 seconds. Using the paper as the wrapper as the weigh paper, I would suggest. Then you're going to chew it for another 30 seconds. I would recommend it be the same person, but if you're close with your partner, you can swap. Okay? So, you're going to weigh it, chew for 30 seconds, weigh it again, chew for 30 seconds, weigh it again, chew for 30 seconds. You're going to do that until you've chewed the gum for 5 minutes. Okay? Once you've done that, the person that's timing also has to record the data, record the results. You need to figure out how you're going to record and keep track of your information. Graph your results, and then evaluate your hypothesis. Were you correct? Did you reject your hypothesis, or did you retain it? What have I forgot? I think that's everything. Sure. I think that's all the information you need at this time to do it. Oh, the person that is chewing the gum also be making observations about the texture, about the flavor, about everything else, jotting those things down somewhere else while you're chewing the gum. Okay? So you're going to have to be multitasking here. One person's going to be chewing, one person's going to be timing. The person chewing is going to be making observations about the chewing. The person timing is going to be recording the data. Does anyone have any questions? Yep. 11. Shouldn't you? 0. You got a 0 time, 30 seconds, minute. I think it's 11, right?
Does anybody need any extra paper?
Okay. Andrew up here at the front table, need some?
Alrighty.
Alrighty. Go ahead and begin. Make sure you weigh your gum before you begin. You can have to share a scale there. Let's see what some of our results were. We'll start with this group up here. If I can get my microphone off again. why don't you kind of just give us a quick summary of what your graph, kind of show the graph to the rest of the group. And you did the chewing. Kind of what did you observe as you were going through there?
The flavor started to go, and you could tell that it started to get a lot harder. You know, the texture started out real smooth, but it got harder.
Okay, what is your? Let's take a look at this. Is their graph they have right here? What's on the y-axis?
Math. This is my x-axis and that's my y. Okay. Okay, this is the grams here, and that's the time in 30 seconds. So, just based on the results, it went down.
So does everyone else have a graph that looks somewhat similar to this? My guess is right about the 2.5, 3 minute mark. See what it is here? 1, 2, yep, about that same time. 3.5 minute mark. Does your graph tend to flatten out a little bit? What happened then? Why did the graph start to flatten out? We show a pretty dramatic drop in mass, then it kind of flattens. All right.
So that's when the flavor started running out.
So there's some correlation between the observations that the chewer was making and the data that was being collected. He said about that same time it started to flatten out, the flavor went away. So what do we think might be happening? What might be causing that mass to decrease? Loss of sugar. Excellent. Okay. So, and you guys used a line graph when you depicted your results. Did you all choose this type of graph when you were doing this? Yes. Why is this the most appropriate graph to be using for this kind of data?
Showing change over time.
It's change over time, called continuous data. Now, I am sure all of you are very similar to those of us in Florida. Ms. Smith knows exactly that lovely thing we call the FCAT. Our state standardized test. On the state standardized science test, graphing skills, organizing data are all part of that standardized test score. And whether or not our ag courses count for science credit, I still feel that we have a responsibility to help our students succeed on those tests. And there are certain rules by which how graphs are being made and why line graphs are the most appropriate here, and me not help your students. Now, one reason I did not give you graph paper is the same reason I didn't give it to my students. I wanted to force them to graph it out. Later on, I did have my students use Excel. But what happens is, if you first do that, they're just clicking on that little Excel sheet, finding the prettiest graph to use. I want them to be able to draw that out. And so we're teaching science process skills in a very simple lab like this. Okay? Let's kind of keep that in the back of the mind as we go through there and trying to keep that experience as we go through. The real question we're going to be talking about here is inquiry. How many of you heard the term inquiry-based instruction? That is one of the many, many educational buzzwords we use now. We kind of throw that around a lot, especially in our state standardized testing. What does inquiry-based instruction mean? What does inquiry look like?
For us, we've been taught to ask essential questions and then let the kids figure out what they have to figure out to learn to answer that.
Asking essential questions. What else does inquiry look like?
It requires some experimentation.
Okay, it requires experimentation when you're doing that. What else? Hang on, my Vanna White, not very quick.
Data, obviously, to go along with the experiment.
Okay. Collecting and analyzing data is very important as well.
It's student-centered.
It's student-centered instruction when we're going through. Excellent. When we talk about inquiry-based instruction, there's a couple of important publications that I think it's good for us to be able, when we're talking with our colleagues in the science education departments, to be able to know about. One of those is called Science for All Americans. It's put out by AAAS, the American Association for Advancement of Science. And the other one is the National Science Standards, put out by the National Research Council. These are two very key publications that really set the standards for science ed. They're the ones by which all other science type things are measured. Both of these publications, one kind of draws upon the other, says that inquiry-based instruction is the way to go. How many of you, when you were going through your teacher education programs, have heard about the problem-solving approach or problem-based learning? They are very, very close cousins to each other. They're not. I don't think they're exact duplicates of each other, but they're very, very close and a lot of relations there. When we talk about what inquiry is, it's about asking these essential questions, getting the students to think about, what do I need to know to answer this question? What do I need to know to make this thing happen? Also critical to that is the team approach. That's what we're very good at here in agriculture education. We talk about this later on, though, in that some early research is finding that teaching leadership skills just as a standalone lesson is not effective. The most effective way to do that is to teach leadership skills in a team setting like lab instruction. And what we're finding is if you take one of those concepts from like a life knowledge lesson, and while you're doing an agri-science lesson, say, okay, while you're doing this agri-science lesson or this lab, focus on communication within the team. How did your team communicate? You give them a context. So you're not only teaching this agri-science content, you're teaching a leadership concept. Next time, let's look about collaboration. Focus on how your teams collaborate. And we're finding that's one of the most effective ways to do that. So you take some of those life knowledge lessons, incorporate those in to your current teaching, not just stand alone. Give them a context when they're doing it. The other thing in here that we need, I asked the folks chewing the gum to observe. How many of your students are great note takers? Not at all. College students are not good note takers. I wasn't a good note taker. But what it is, everything you put up on the board, they're writing down. If you notice, we're doing this unplugged. Just a man on his flip chart. No PowerPoint. Because what happens on a PowerPoint? They're writing down every single word you got up there. Teaching our students how to make observations. What's the important things to be noticing and what's just the stuff? To figure out what to be making, you've got to teach those type of skills. Those are science process skills that are important. When we talk about inquiry-based instruction, there are 4 basic views or 4 basic camps when we're looking at inquiry-based instruction. The first of these focuses strictly on content, or the what. This is the technical knowledge, the technical information. This is the stand and deliver, just the lecture type stuff. Is lecture bad? Absolutely not. The lecture is a very effective teaching tool. Just like a hammer is a very good tool, a hammer doesn't do you a lot of good in plumbing. You've got to use it when it's most appropriate. Okay? Focus is just on the what. The second type we go through is called content with process. The content here is still most important, but what also is important is we look at the process by which the content was gained. How do we know these certain facts are true? This is what we call teaching as inquiry. Teaching as inquiry here with content with process. This content with process is what the national science standards say is the most effective way to teach science-based information. Thus, we can say this is probably the most effective way to teach agri-science related information. The third one here is process with content, where we're focused mainly on the how and the what's kind of secondary. This is called teaching by inquiry. And the last one is process, where we focus just on the how. Some of us that may have been playing this game a few more years might remember back in the 60s and 70s, this was what we thought was going to be the best way to teach science. There was a big movement right then. We thought that if we would just teach all of our kids a certain set of skills, that they would be able to take those skills and apply them wherever they wanted to. What we found out was these kids could do it when we told them to, but didn't know when to apply which skill. So process by itself is not real effective. What we're finding out is the most effective here is to focus on content, still having our objectives, but the process is important as well. So, how do we do that? How do we make this thing happen? How do we teach as inquiry? The first one we talked about, Ms. Smith mentioned asking questions. How many of you are good at asking thought-provoking, critical thinking type questions to your students on the fly? I am horrible at it. I have to cheat. If you look here on my lesson plan, I have the questions I'm going to ask you written here on the side. And by doing this workshop a few times or lessons with my students, I finally come up with some good questions from time to time. So I seed my lesson plan with good thought-provoking questions. Because to me, that is one of the most critical skills that we can do as teachers, is asking those good questions. Another technique that we use with this, and it frustrates your students as all get out when you first start it, but it's called the yes-no technique, or kind of 20 questions. You go through there and you tell your class, what I found it worked best as a classroom exercise, okay, you guys as a class can ask me 20 questions to get to this concept. It taught great teamwork, getting them to think about what's going on with their thought process. So when they were doing that, they would start working together with each other to figure out, okay, thinking almost like a chess game, thinking 4 or 5 steps ahead, what kind of question they need to ask. I said it was frustrating. It worked best with my older students. My freshmen started doing it toward the end of the year, but you can't just jump into that technique. You got to kind of walk them up to that stage. But the next one here is science process skills. We talked about those with lab, different kind of skills they're going to be doing. Observation, graphing, data collection, data management are very important. Next is discrepant events. These are one of the best things out there. We've got discrepant events all over in ag. Things that just don't work out the way we think they're supposed to. Okay? And you say, what happened? One of my favorite ones to do dealt with plants in the greenhouse. You could buy this fertilizer. It's like Miracle Grow fertilizer, but it has a nutrient missing from it. So I would have students fertilizing and watering these plants. They would mix the fertilizer, and this plant would be showing this deficiency. So we'd go through here and going, did you guys fertilize? Yeah, we put the stuff in there, but what's wrong with this plant? And we'd go through. They would think, hey, this thing's supposed to be healthy and active, but it's not. What's going on? And we would use that. We would go for about 9 weeks having them go through at different times, trying to figure out what's going on with that plant using that discrepant event. Next, we got inductive and deductive activities. Anybody know the difference? What's an inductive activity compared to a deductive activity? Inductive means we give them an experience, and they try to figure out, okay, this is what happened. Now let's go find the rules to why it happened that way. That's one of the most effective. There's some safety concerns with some things, but the very most effective. Deductive is give them an experience, and give them all the rules, and then do something to kind of illustrate those rules. Last one here, last one here I want to talk about, this is where Andrew and I have spent most of this week. Science projects. There's something else out there. I don't have any to give you, but I see one here on the table. Something's come out. Agriscience Fair Promising Practices Guide. Okay, we're doing some self-promotion here because Andrew and I helped write this. There's boxes of them over at the Agriscience Fair right now that you can pick one up. What those are hints from very successful teachers, very successful projects on how to manage science fair type projects with your students. You do not have to do science fair projects individually. One of the best ways that I did it was have a classroom project. With my 8th graders, they had to design a hydroponics unit that fit in a small little space due to limitations. They started there. Some of them took that and developed that into a science fair project. You can start with that group-wide thing that may intrigue somebody and get them going on. The last thing is groups. We've already talked about that. Teaching students in groups is so important. In a lab setting, we found to be the most effective way to do that. Using that life knowledge and incorporating things in that way, shape, or form. One of the things we talk about in the bubblegum lab, who designed the question that you were going to investigate? I did. I told you we're going to find what's going to happen to the mass of the bubble gum. Who went through and told you what materials you were going to use? I did. Who told you what your procedure was going to follow? I did. Who told you how to, so I was very teacher directed. We call that a cookbook type lab. That's what you're going to find in any type of textbook that you have out there. That's just the way that they're written. But inquiry-based instruction says we need to move away, we need to move beyond the cookbook. How many of you have just oodles and oodles of time laying around where you're doing nothing but sitting around picking your nose, eating the boogers? Not very long. So do you have time to develop your own lab activities? Well, what can we do to take these cookbook labs and modify them to make them more inquiry-based? What are some things that we can do to help make the student kind of be more engaged in the activity, but yet still meet the objectives? That's one of the misconceptions people have about inquiry-based instruction. They think, Let's all just get in a big room and learn something. You as the teacher are still responsible for learning. So how do you modify a cookbook lab to still meet your objectives? Okay, let the students identify the question to be answered. Take pieces out of it. Most of those lab sheets that we have now, you can get on, they have PDFs to go with them, and you can modify them. And the easiest thing that I would do is take out the results question. I just teach you guys how to organize your data. And I'm sure you've got students that got it on the back of the bubble gum wrapper or everything else trying to figure out what's going on. Show them there's a format to collecting information. The next thing that I would do is take out some of the pieces of the procedure section. So they would have to go through and figure out what's going on there. That's pretty big when they're doing that. But taking out bits and pieces to it makes it more inquiry-based when they're making those things happen. So that's what I want you guys to do now. One of the other ways that you can make things less cookbook. Whoop, wrong piece of paper. Flip my chart. Flipped it too early. One of the other ways to do it is to do a cookbook lab. And now from the lab that we just did it answer all of your questions about what happened there? You have a lot more questions. What kind of variables did we not control for when we were measuring the mass of the bubble gum? Did everybody chew it the same number of times? If we're going to say that it was sugar that made the weight go down, what causes sugar to dissolve? Saliva. It's your enzymes, amylase enzymes in there. Do we all have the same amount of amylase enzymes all day long? Do you individually have the same amount in your saliva throughout the day? It always changes, so there's things that we can modify to make those things happen. What I want you to do now with your partner is to design the next step experiment or lab that you could do based off of this particular activity. Okay? What's the next step that our students could do with this? All kind of things you guys come up with. What's the next step that you're going to be doing with this lab activity?
How long would it take to dissolve all the sugar?
Okay, try to go through and see what happens. How long, if you keep this thing going, what's going to happen to that graph line? To see if there's a time thing. What else? What else could we do to take this to the next step?
We said we could compare sugar-free versus the sugar gum and see if there's any comparison in mass.
Okay, and that's one thing we had a great discussion back there with this group. We've done that before. So what would you expect to have happen if you did this exact same procedure but used sugarless gum?
I guess from this result, you would think it would stay the same. The mass would stay the same because there's no sugar in it.
Okay, in the sugarless gum, you would expect to see a flat line sugar, right? The mass not stained. I've done that before. You don't think so? Why not?
If it doesn't dissolve by the saliva, how would you taste it?
Okay, that's what happens. When you've done that, when I've done that lab with sugarless gum, it follows almost the same trend line as the Hubba Bubba, the sugar gum does. So what's happening?
It's the sugar alcohol that's the sugar.
Okay, so there's something else in there that's happening. That's why it's so important. What did our people that were observing, that were chewing the gum, what observation did they make as they were chewing the gum when that line started to flatten out a little bit? The taste, the flavor was gone. If the person's doing that with the sugar-free gum, the same thing's going to be happening. So this is a case of a discrepant event that you used to talk about, but also a time to say, let's look at these hard numbers. These hard numbers, didn't come back the way we thought they were, but let's take the observations that we had, put these two things together, and say, what's happening here is whatever's causing the flavor, that's dropping our mass. So again, to show that sometimes kids get this idea that it's the hard numbers all the time. We've got to live by the numbers. The numbers don't always tell you the story. You've got to tie it in with those other comments, the other observations that you've got going on as well when you're making those things happen. Where do you use a lab like this? Was I just the world's worst ag teacher because I use this lab in my high school ag classrooms? No, I was at worst for several other reasons, but what else? Where do you use this lab activity? Learning scientific method. Digestion. I always went through there and referred back to this with my digestion lab, talking about why does the sugar dissolve, talking about enzymes, and going through those kind of things. What else could you use this for? Practicing for Agriscience, generating ideas, the whole scientific process through there. I did this lab, quite honestly, I did it with my 8th graders because it was cool, and we got to play with gum. I got them excited, making things go on, and some Agriscience concepts. I did it with my freshmen to introduce them to the scientific method, the different concepts of making those things happen. I did it with my advanced course because they did more Agriscience-y type things. I wanted a refresher for them on the teaching method. What I found out was spending one day on this lab activity saved me about 4 weeks on the back end of that class by having them think about the scientific method and what was going on there. Having them figure these things out. The other things that I had them do is I had my students write a lab report on this activity. You're going, Myers, what are you nuts? Why did I have my students, and I didn't do this at first, but the last few years I taught high school, I'd have my students write a lab report on this particular lab. I did that so that they would learn how to write a lab report. And they weren't focused on the content. They could focus just on the structure. The lab report was 3 pages. But they focused on that. And the lab reports that I got later on in the year were so much better than the first ones that I got when I had them trying to teach them how to write a lab report and trying to teach them about some other concept that I was doing. The other thing we're finding out now is we found a thing called a VMAP. And what that VMAP is a one-page lab report. It is the coolest thing since sliced bread, in my opinion. Because what that does, the bad thing about having students do lab reports that are pretty thick is I got to read them all. But what this VMAP does, it has all the components of a full lab report. I'm not saying eliminate lab reports completely, but a one-pager that the students complete that the teachers are telling us it takes about 30 seconds to grade. We've got it. It's a Word document. The kids can write it on, type it right there. It also locks them into a certain space. So that tells me they've got to give me the results in this much space rather than a half a page. Why is that important? Correct vocabulary. It also, I tell them, pretend like every word costs you $1. And really makes them think about their sentence structure, make sure those words are powerful, increases critical thinking out the roof. It's because they're thinking, wow, you're only making me write this much, this is going to be easy. It's actually more difficult, more thought-provoking than writing a half page or a full page. I know I teach the research methods course for our grad students, and I tell them their perspectives has to be 8 pages. I got folks who want to turn in 15 or 20 pages. I don't want to read it. I want 8 pages, number one, because I'm lazy, and number two, it's going to make you think harder to get those things in there. The last thing real quick to kind of summarize what's going on here. I think one of the things that we can do in Agriscience that's going to make us stand out is teaching in the lab facilities that we have available to us and using inquiry-based instruction in those ways. Not just Agriscience type labs. Test tubes and beakers and DNA and all that stuff is awesome. I love it. I teach classes on it. I like doing it. But hopefully you saw here we can teach inquiry-based instruction, science skills with bubble gum and scales. Doesn't take a whole lot. It's not so much about what you do, it's how you do it. The other thing, we have land lab school farms that are a great way to teach inquiry-based instructions, gardens, greenhouses. Use those things as educational tools. I always tell them what we use. It's a minor bit of terminology, but we don't call the place with all the mechanic stuff the shop. It's the ag mechanics lab. Why is it in the shop? Because that's why we have a maintenance department. Shop is where you fix something. An ag mechanics lab is a place where learning takes place. Are we fixing stuff? Yeah, but our main goal here is learning, not just to fix the product. So use our lab facilities in that way. I came up with there's a 3-step approach that we think to lab instruction planning. I was really ingenious when I came up with these labels. Pre-lab. When do you think that happens? Probably before the lab. You're a rocket scientist here. There's 2 major pieces of this thing, administrative and instruction, I think. Administrative talks about gathering all your toys. Make sure you have the equipment available. If there's any way possible, your school's going to let you have like a teaching assistant or a student assistant, they're a godsend. They're wonderful. if you get a senior student or a good student you can trust to help gather things up. Some schools will let you do it, some won't. But that's going to help so much. Plus, I hated doing dishes, so I could always have them do it. Instruction. Talk about basic skills that they need to know. Also, safety instruction. Like a lot of you, before we ever went out to the lab, students had to pass a safety test. I made them pass the test with a 95%. They said, why do I have to have a 95%? Because I don't want you being a 75% safe. Because more than likely, you're not going to hurt yourself, you're going to hurt me. And I want all my fingers and toes when I come back inside. Second step we talk about is actually during the lab experience themselves. The way you teach inquiry is not the way our students have been trained from about kindergarten on. I've got a 7-year-old right now in 2nd grade. I keep thinking that sometime shortly in his life, I'm going to appreciate his independent streak. That day has not arrived yet, but I'm sure it will happen. But I look at him and I can watch what's happening, how they're. He's got great teachers, but they want him to sit still, do this, write this thing out, do this the whole time, and he's a 110% boy. He's going and playing in the dirt and stuff. But the whole parenting thing's giving me a new perspective on the kids by the time we get them. That whole being inquisitive, trying to find the answer thing has been beat out of them. In inquiry, we got to get them back to being more engaged in there. Is that going to happen overnight? Absolutely not. They will rise up with pitchforks and torches and beat you if you try to do that. You walk them slowly to this inquiry-based stage and teach them how to do it. The other thing is that the teacher role has to change. We have to be more facilitator than the giver of knowledge. That's hard for some of us. And I always tell my students the most difficult thing to do is let a student fail on a project. Because you see something happening and I want to go in and fix it because I'm a fixer. My wife hates that. She wants to talk to me about something and I'm like, let's go fix it. And she just wants me to shut up and listen. But you got to let them fail a little bit to be able to think about, okay, what happened here? How do you make that happen? Every Agriscience lab is not going to work. Now, this bubblegum lab is the most fail-proof lab I've ever used in my life. But other ones, you're going to have kids, you're going to do a lab experiment, and some kid's going to get crazy stuff. Who knows what happened? Sometimes we call those train wrecks. Sometimes those train wrecks are the best learning experiences you have. The last thing is a post-lab. Some sort of debriefing thing to talk about what happened. And a culminating activity to talk about the content. Debriefing, talk about the process. Why do you think we did it the way that we did? Why did we measure the gum every 30 seconds? Why didn't I just have you weigh it, chew it for 5 minutes, and weigh it again? If we did that, we never would have seen that trend line. That's where we teach the process type things. The culminating activity is really this VMAP or the lab report. Something that talks about the concept. Get them to focus on the content which you're trying to teach them. Because we're trying to meet those different objectives. Questions, comments, concerns you have for me? Yes, sir.